A very good morning to all of you. It's an absolute pleasure and a privilege for us to be able to host the Granville Austin Memorial Lecture by my very dear friend Vikram Raghavan. It's also a very special moment for us to be able to host this lecture because besides his outstanding credentials as a scholar, a researcher, a remarkable individual, Vikram is also the biographer of Granville Austin. For all the students who are present here, and I'm sure Vikram will touch this aspect in the course of his lecture, Granville Austin is somebody who inspired generations of Indian legal scholars, historians, researchers, parliamentarians, and others who wanted to understand the evolution of Indian constitution. And such was Granville Austin's influential work, beginning with his first book on Indian Constitution, cornerstone of the nation, and followed by a book later he wrote on the idea of working a democratic constitution, the Indian experience. It was remarkable for a man to be able to navigate the entire constitution making process and to very, very meticulously, rigorously, in an evidence-based manner, document all of that in the form of that book. So we decided some years ago to institute and endo a lecture in the memory of Granville Austin. I had the privilege to meet Dr. Austin when I was a student initially in Delhi University at the Campus Law Center when he came for the book launch. But more importantly for me personally, when I was a student at Harvard Law School, I had the opportunity to meet him and invite him for a conference that we hosted in April 2000 on human rights and Indian judiciary's constitutional jurisprudence. I specifically want to thank my friend Vikram for accepting our invitation to be here amidst many of his important assignments in India, not just in Delhi, but also in other parts of India. Vikram, as I told to a bunch of my colleagues shortly before, he has been a great source of inspiration for me personally, not just now, but long ago. When I was a student in the year 1994 at Campus Law Center, Delhi University, Vikram was at the same time a student of the National Law School of India, University Bengaluru. And I had the privilege to visit NLS Bangalore as a part of a research project that we were undertaking on protecting local communities, their resources and the environment, where Professor N.R. Madhav Menon launched that project with a view to infusing social values in law and advocacy. And I was part of a group of young lawyers, law students from Delhi University visiting, and that's when I met Vikram for the first time. He was already a renowned young scholar, a student scholar, a researcher, and later he moved to NYU and he got the Hauser Global Scholarship and pursued his LLM program at NYU, following which he worked at one of America's leading law firms known as O. Melvini and Myers, where he achieved distinction. I used to know him when I was also in New York. But a good part of his career, he has been working in international organizations, and that's been part of his journey. I also want to mention that besides being an amazing lawyer, Vikram has also, fulfilled his own passionate interest in research, writing, as well as being a scholar. He is one of the most distinguished public intellectual. He has been actively writing on some of the big issues of our time, as well as he's one of those individuals who, all of us in the world of academia or outside, we end up getting bracketed. So, for example, you're either a human rights person or a corporate person or a commercial law person or a trade law person. But Vikram is one of those rare individuals who has straddled across multiple worlds. And so because of that professional, journeys that he has undertaken across different worlds, his own academic and research interest also is across multiple worlds. He has been actively engaged in the public law discourse while writing and researching on a range of issues surrounding public law, but on constitutional law and issues surrounding it. but he also has done some phenomenal pioneering work in other aspects of law. As some of you may or may not remember, one of his early works is on telecommunication law, something at that time nobody would have dared to write, or for that matter had enough information to write. And of course, more recently, he's been so much interested in constitutional histories, history of individuals who shaped the development of institutions, including the Supreme Court of India, and all of that he does it as an aside from his regular job. So I am deeply grateful to Mr. Vikram Raghavan for accepting our invitation to deliver the Granville Austin Memorial Lecture. Vikram, I should tell you that this auditorium was undertaken in a record speed. We completely revamped this auditorium in the last 30 days so that it is available for your event. So this will be the first event that we are hosting in this newly renovated global auditorium. So we are also it augurs well for us to begin this new journey in this new forum with the Granville Austin Memorial Lecture on the theme that Vikram himself has chosen, which is about Granville Austin and transformative constitutionalism. I also want to thank Professor Sudarshan, the Dean of the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, who has so kindly accepted our invitation to reflect on the work of Granville Austin, but also connect it to Vikram's own interests, but also to share some special moments about the journeys and evolution of Granville Austin himself. I also want to thank my colleague and friend Professor Srijit and other assistant deans and associate deans of the Jindal Global Law School for working very hard in the last several weeks to put together this very distinguished lecture. I know that students who are here listening to this lecture, but also others who are listening to this lecture through the YouTube live that is happening as right now, will be immensely benefited by what Vikram is going to speak, but also to be able to recognize the interdisciplinary engagement of law. And what Granville Austin has done through his seminal works is to, long before many of us, especially in the world of law, have recognized the role of interdisciplinarity and indeed, especially history, but also other disciplines in shaping the evolution of law. Such was the impact of the work of Granville Austin. We are very fortunate that we have been able to institute this lecture. I believe, and what Vikram told me recently is that we have also got the endorsement and indeed the blessings of the family members of Dr. Granville Austin as we embark on this journey today. So thank you very much for your presence, and I look forward to the lecture itself, and I sincerely hope that you will all enjoy what you're going to hear, but also actively participate in the Q&A session, which will be followed by the lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for such a heartwarming welcome and introduction to Mr. Raghavan. And so we are very fortunate to have you amidst us today. I now request Professor S.G. Srijit, Executive Dean, Jindal Global Law School, to please share the introductory remarks.
Good morning to everybody. It's a great honor to give the introductory remarks in this lecture, distinguished lecture in honor of Professor Granville Austin, to be delivered by Mr. Vikram Raghavan. I'll reflect a little bit on this theme, transformative constitutionalism. It can mean two things. One is the Constitution's ability to transform the society, and second is the ability of the Constitution itself to stay time-transcending, to ability to transform itself. In a movie with honors, the protagonist asks a question: what is the particular genius of the Constitution? Well, this is in the context of American Constitution. And he gets a response that the genius of the Constitution is that it can always be changed. The genius of the Constitution is that it makes no permanent rule other than its faith in the wisdom of the ordinary people to govern themselves. And he continues, Our founding fathers were great men, nay, women too. And they knew what all great men, nay, women should know, that they did not know everything and left a way for us to change this. So instead, by this particular dialogue, I asked this question: what is the particular genius of the Indian Constitution? And the response is that Indian Constitution has the ability to transcend the time. It's a time transcending constitution. That means the ability to stay relevant no matter whatever temporal changes happen. No matter the tempest of the time, the avalanches of the change, the tectonic shifts in the society, the Indian Constitution emerges safe like that proverbial ship, though weather beaten, emerging from the turbulence. And when everything around us falls down, the Indian Constitution has the remarkable ability to become the Noah's Ark, safeguarding us within its iron walls. But still the question stacks: why the Indian Constitution is time transcending? Because Indian Constitution is not really a set of time-fixated commandments which will keep us within a strange, mysterious time loop. Rather, Indian Constitution has an epistemological purpose. I remember the statements of Madhav Khosla in his book, The Founding Moments of Indian Constitution, that Indian Constitution is a continuing education in democratic values. Let me try to respond to this question further within the 5 minutes generously bestowed upon me by the organizers by way of an imagery. This imagery is presented by Italo Calvino in his novel, The Castle of Crossed Destinies. There is a castle where the travelers meet, but the moment you enter the castle, you will be deprived of your ability to speak. You have no power of speech. You will be given a pile of tarot cards. Using the tarot cards, you have to communicate with each of them. Each member arranges the tarot card in a certain sequential order, and their life story is formed. You change the sequential order, yet another life story will be formed. So you change the order, you change the sequence, you get a different story. But then what we have to understand is that Indian Constitution has this kind of same semiotic power as these tarot cards in Italo Calvino's The Castle of Crossed Destinies. The Indian Constitution, when I say it has the same semiotic power, what I mean is that Indian Constitution does not speak one reality. It gives us the opportunity to create our own realities within the values of the democracy. It's like the tarot card. There are many moments in the Indian Constitution. Each clause of the Constitution is our story. Spinning it in a certain way, we can create our own realities. So taken in isolation, each tarot card in the novel in question is in fact a social context. It's a social context. And we have to leave these contexts by enlivening our own identities there. As the sequences changes, the life's pattern changes. As the order changes, the life's pattern again changes. Anyway, as the pile of the tarot has the story of everybody who came to that castle, in the same manner, the Indian Constitution has all our stories included in that. We just need to go and discover that story. Hence, we call the Indian Constitution a living constitution. I conclude here by quoting Alfred Tennyson's The Brook. But I'm going to make some adaptations here. I chatter and chatter as I flow. I chatter and chatter as I flow. The Constitution keeps on whispering every moment the democratic values to our ears. I chatter and chatter as I flow. To join the brimming river. The brimming river actually, is joining in the eternity of the humanity. Indian Constitution will stay here until humanity stays on the surface of the earth. For men may come and men may go. Nay, people may come and people may go. But I go on forever. I believe that's by an introduction for the larger scheme of things to follow. I'm too small in this big scheme of things. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Srijit, for that very insightful remarks. I now invite Professor R. Sudarshan, Dean, Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, to please share his reflections on the contributions of Dr. Granville Austin.
Thank you very much, Surabhi. I'm particularly delighted to be here. Firstly, because just the other day, this auditorium was a complete mess 2 days ago. And so I'm absolutely amazed that it's so beautiful and orderly, and this is the first event that we are having in this renovated auditorium. And it's therefore very fitting that a dear friend, Vikram Raghavan, begins the auditorium's new session of what we hope would be many such events of intellectual quality. I'm particularly touched that the Vice Chancellor decided to institute the Granville Austin Memorial Lecture because I got to know Granville Austin. I won't go into how, but I was in Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, figuring out what to do. I'd done my MA in economics in the Delhi School of Economics. It's quite a rigorous, highly theoretical program, and I wanted a break from economics. So I was looking around to see what I might do. I knew I had a scholarship, so I spent the first year doing philosophy, and gradually got interested in law because one of my tutors in the philosophy of law was Joseph Raz, who was a remarkable intellectual. And then I decided I will do a master's in politics. And at that time, I was trying to figure out, what would I write my MA thesis on. And I was introduced to Dr. Kamal Hussain, who was then a fellow at Nafil College. He had to flee Bangladesh because Sheikh Mujibur Rahman had been assassinated. And at that time, Kamal Hussain was the foreign minister of Bangladesh. He was also played a big part in drafting the constitution of independent Bangladesh. So I was talking to him, and he suggested to me that I read Granville Austin's book on the cornerstone of a nation and write my dissertation for the MPhil on amendments that happened after Granville Austin's great account of how the Constitution was founded. Kamal Hussain also said to me, you have another choice. You could read Granville Austin, or you could read about 17 volumes of Mr. Shiva Rao on the framing of the Constitution. And so that was a forbidding task. And so we found this excellent account of a story about how the Constitution got framed. Now, it's remarkable that it's such an accessible account, and I went on to then do a seminar in Oxford with, of course, Joseph Raz, but also John Finnis and Ronald Dworkin, and we invited Justices Bhagawati and Krishna Iyer to come to that seminar and discuss a couple of their judgments in the Supreme Court. I said to Professor Hart was also there. I said, law students in Oxford only seem to be looking at what the law lords have said or what the United States Supreme Court has said, and they don't study what Indian judges have done, and they are among the more innovative and creative judges because the Constitution of India creates one of the most powerful judiciaries in the world. The Constitution says the law laid down by the Supreme Court shall be the law of the land, alongside what Parliament might enact or state legislators might enact. It gives the Supreme Court the power to do complete justice, which means you don't have to necessarily be bound by what is argued before you as judges. It also has the High Courts of India have always had the prerogative writs, which in fact the High Courts applied during the emergency, and the Supreme Court then went by the letter of the law at that time, Article 359, and said the President has suspended fundamental rights, we can't help you. And that was, the senior Chandrachud. Fortunately, the Junior Chandrachud in Puttaswamy more recently overturned that ruling in ADM Jabalpur, and in ADM, and said that this ruling must be buried 10 fathoms deep. I'm not quite sure about that, because the Article 359 has been amended. It only omits 19 and 21, and still requires that it be followed in a subsequent case of any declaration of emergency. Now, that apart, what inspired me was that this was such a wonderful, accessible account of founding. So I'm very grateful to Dr. Kamal Hussain, who introduced me to this book and to the idea that amendments to the Constitution of India are worth following and studying in earnest. And therefore, I felt that I should do that, so I began work on it. I didn't publish my work, but after I came in contact with Red Austin, I was able to share with him a lot of my notes and findings, and we had many, many long discussions. And it's very gratifying that he's been criticized, especially by Professor Upendra Bakshi for being, what is he kind of thing. Vikram would say a little more about it, I'm sure. But it's not for nothing that, judges of the Supreme Court down the line have cited him, especially on this very vexed question that we had about fundamental rights and directive principles. Austin actually, on the chapter dealing with directive principles, calls it Fundamental Rights 2. He doesn't title it Directive Principles because he was really convinced that the two parts of the Constitution, which he called the conscience of the Constitution, went together. And of course, he knows that the division between fundamental rights, directive principles was influenced by Isaiah Berlin's two concepts of liberty, where you call something a right if there is an enforceable remedy, and if you have some rights that can only be realized progressively without an immediate remedy, then you'd rather not call it a right. That's Isaiah Berlin's view. That somehow came into our Constitution as well. But Red Austin believed that together they were the soul of the Constitution of India. And so there's been, on those judgments dealing with the fundamental rights, directive principles, and their interrelationships, judges have quoted Austin in extenso. They have quoted him in the state of Rajasthan on federalism. In fact, the phrase which the current government uses, cooperative federalism, is something that Austin refers to. But he's always a meticulous scholar. He always gives you a source. So he doesn't say, I invented cooperative federalism. He'll say there was an author called A.H. Birch who wrote about the federalism in the United States and Australia, who used that phrase. And it's better than Weir or somebody else calling it quasi-federal or federal in theory, but unitary in practice, and so on. So therefore, it's understandable why judges would find this accessible, and it's also important because otherwise our Constitution could have been read as an updated version of the Government of India Act of 1935. Unfortunately, in many respects, our Constitution is incomplete. For instance, on the powers of the role of the governor, in the Assembly, they had decided that they will have a schedule replicating the instrument of instructions that the British had for their governors, but changing it so that the governors in India, in independent India, would not be partisan and would not be political, would be independent in that respect, and give sage and wise advice to the government of the states. And therefore, they were given a sort of a code of conduct, but that never got incorporated in the Constitution. With the result, we pretty much have the same provisions that the Government of India Act of 1935 had with respect to its governors, and it creates problems, as we know. So in many respects, the task of constitution making couldn't be finished in the time that they had. But you needed someone like Austin, who comes to the subject as a PhD scholar. I mean, he may have been interested in India earlier in his younger life. I don't know what prompted him to do that. But then here is a narrative that kind of holds. I mean, the book in itself is a seamless web, which is a phrase he uses to describe the Constitution. But this inspired me. And later I was very fortunate to spend many hours with him, as I mentioned. But one of the things we did in Oxford at that time was produce a festschrift for Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer. It's called Judges and the Judicial Power. Some of you might find it in the library. It's a nice collection. It's got articles by Lord Denning, Lord Scarman, Archibald Cox, who was the special prosecutor for Watergate, Rajiv Dhawan, Salman Khurshid, and I edited it, and that is a consequence of that seminar that I mentioned that we had organized. So I look forward to Vikram's more detailed enunciation of why Granville Austin remains relevant and important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sudarshan, for that. Sometimes we forget how these beginnings happened. I just was able to track down an email. In the year 2014, Granville Austin died, and the news came to us. And Sudarshan sends me an email on 8th July 2014 saying that, for your information, maybe we should institute a memorial lecture in the name of Granville Austin. And now, of course, I replied saying, yes, we will indeed. But then Sudarshan sends a message to Nancy, who's Austin's wife, and I'm going to read that message. It says, Biju Rao has shared with me your email address, and Vikram conveyed to me the saddening news of the passing away of Red. You have been Red's alter ego. You are with us, and so Red remains with us, and we can pray that he may live long with us in that way. So let the bell toll, we know it tolls for us, and meanwhile we can fondly remember the wonderfully lovely human being we have been fortunate to have known. May God give you and your daughters all strength. Red will be able to intercede on our behalf with divinity better than he could before. Lots of love, Sudarshan. With those words, I'm going to invite Mr. Vikram Raghavan to deliver the Granville Austin Memorial Lecture.
Hi. It's a great honor for me to deliver the Granville Austin Memorial Lecture. I thank Vice Chancellor Dr. C. Rajkumar, who I've known for more than 3 decades, for having given me this privilege. It's been 13 years since I've been on this campus, and the change, of course, is beyond belief, including this room, which I understand was constructed in record time. So it's obviously change that's still galloping and ongoing. And I know how hard it is to pull this off, because I was a skeptic of Jindal, of the project that this would work, that we could build a private institution that would be a global school of excellence, given how hard it is to establish institutions in India. But I've been proved wrong, and I freely admit it. And the tribute must go to the Vice Chancellor, but to the faculty and all of you. There is another connection between the school and the subject of today's lecture, which is I first met Granville Austin at Harvard Law School at this conference that Rajkumar mentioned, which was actually organized by him when he wasn't a professor. He was a law student like the rest of you. He even had his own phone number, which is obviously not his anymore. And I must acknowledge also Pratibha Jain, his partner and crime in this partner in crime in this venture and many more other things. Right? She's not here with us today, but this was the place I met Austin. And so even though Austin is not mentioned, this was the announcement in the Harvard Crimson newspaper about this conference, which was a conference that took place, which involved the the existing Attorney General and Law Minister, but also had a lot of these dignitaries, judges, and Granville Austin, who came up from Washington, where I then moved to a few months or probably a year after the conference. And I stayed in touch with Red and Nancy Austin. He was called Red because his hair was red when he grew up. Of course, later it became white, but the uniqueness of a red-haired person, which charmed and beguiled many people, especially in India, was something that he bore with pride. But it was only after Austin's passing in 2014 that I developed a deeper understanding of the man as a resilient researcher, insightful scholar, and a devoted family man. Now, there are two factors for this phenomenon. First, I had privileged access to most of Austin's papers, his files, his correspondence, before they were shipped off to where they are now, which is Princeton University. Second, I gained a deeper understanding of both Red and Nancy through my conversations with their family, particularly their daughter, Hillary Austin. And in this lecture, I will draw on these and other streams of sharing, learning, and discussions, particularly with Parv Tyagi, who is a law student like all of you, who helped me prepare today's lecture and whom I want to acknowledge. As the Republic, our Republic's first historian, Austin offers an authoritative, engaging, and difficult to eclipse account of India's founding, or as some would suggest more modestly, the framing of our Constitution. Indeed, most scholars and commentators would probably agree that Austin's book, The Indian Constitution, the Cornerstone of a Nation, shaped the dominant and until today largely multi-partisan across the political spectrum, telling of our republic's creation story, how it was born and how it came into being. That is not to say that this book is without flaws, without missteps and exclusions. Like anything of its time, error is prone, judgments, are based on what you know then. You put something into a book, you deliberately exclude other things, and there are judgments to be made. So Austin's work, therefore, is subject to a lot of comment, review, and considerable criticism. And in this lecture, I don't propose to revisit and survey those assessments, although obviously I have to acknowledge they exist. And I invite you to read my friend Arvind Ilangovan's article on the national narrative of the telling, where he also recognizes Professor Shorbani Sen's work on this subject. In this lecture, though, I want to argue instead something different, that Austin was among the first commentators to proclaim that our Constitution is a radical, revolutionary, and social document. Radical. He kept saying that all the time, right? And this is a sentiment, of course, he picked up early. And he picked this up from his conversations with members of the Constituent Assembly, people who were still alive at the time he came to Delhi in 1960, with whom he met, who he sort of tracked down, forced himself to get a meeting with, and gained their confidence and interviewed them. So and in this respect, therefore, Austin was a forerunner or prophet, like Upendra Bakshi decades later, for what we broadly understand to be transformative constitutionalism, which I'm sure all of you have heard in courses, right? But as I will explain, there are key differences between Austin's thesis of the Constitution being a social document and the definitions, methods, and controversies surrounding contemporary understandings of transformative constitutionalism. Now, in his second book, Working a Democratic Constitution, Austin placed the social revolution, the fact that the Constitution is supposed to instigate a social revolution within what he called a seamless web, together with national unity and democracy. In fact, I found in your Vice Chancellor's office a copy of this book, and it is special because it's actually autographed by Austin. So you better keep it safely because some people might be looking for it. But obviously, it's available on lots of websites that are open to the general public. It is a common resource that everyone should have, either on their bookshelf or their laptop. So in this book, Austin admitted that this book, as Sudarshan was explaining, was written 25 years later, after the first book, which he wrote when he was just a little older than those of you who are in the room. So he came back to write this book sort of in middle age or close, towards the later stage of his life. But he admitted that in constitutional practice over 5 decades, democracy had been subordinate in the name of social revolution. So it's not like he walked back this idea that the Constitution is a radical social document. He nuanced that message, which I will come to. Okay? So to recollect Austin's work, though, we must understand his life. Who was he? And why did he come to write this book? What were the intellectual influences? Should we dim the lights a bit, or yeah? Okay. I don't know if it gives them a headache. Okay. So I have offered a basic outline of the key milestones and events in Austin's life, and obviously I draw from some work that I've done previously on this subject, which you can find online. I've also spoken on this topic a couple of times, and those recordings are on YouTube. But today I want to offer a few additional details that were not available to me previously, particularly the intellectual influences on Austin and the so-called missing middle. He had disappeared. Professor Bakshi called him Rip Van Winkle. What had happened between writing these books? I tried to answer that mystery for you today. So let's begin at the beginning. Austin is born in 1927. He grows up in this small town called Norwich, which is right there in the top of the United States, close to the Canadian border, very cold, lots of skiing. So he, like Swami and his friends in Malgudi Tays, Austin and his band of buddies, their only indulgences were milkshakes and skiing, because they also grew up in the Great Depression. And so Austin had a somewhat austere childhood in that sense. And he's written about this in a book that he wrote close to the end of his life, which I urge you to read. Now, in 1946, Austin goes across the river from Norwich to Dartmouth College, which is in New Hampshire. It's a liberal arts degree that he pursues. And among other things, obviously, Austin was, a sportsman. And he had, more friends and buddies that he made at Dartmouth. He graduated in 1950. This is the first time I think I'm showing this photo, because I only found it 2 days ago. This, I think, is of his graduation. And he has that look that all of you will have when you don your graduation cap, right? Strange look to be in this unusual attire. But continents away, of course, India's Constituent Assembly had just completed its labors, and the Constitution had been signed and came into force. Now, it's unclear to me whether Austin took note of it, right? Because this is the year he graduated. Presumably, he read the newspapers. But it does not appear that he was particularly interested in India at this point, at least from what I know so far. Instead, he decided to go see the world. And, his first port of call was Europe. He went around the world, and he was a journalist for various newspapers and outlets that we don't really know of today, or they don't exist. But for the first few years of his life, he was a wanderer and sort of got a peripatetic knowledge of the world as it existed in practice, right, rather than theory. And he then decided to apply for a sort of real job, if you will, or a job behind a desk, which he got, which was the United States Information Service. Those of you know who have frequented the American Center here or in other Indian cities, in the embassy and in the consulates, there is a USIS office which serves as a library. They give you career counseling, whatever. They are all over the world, and Austin joined the USIS in Saigon, which was then in in Vietnam, and the sort of war was just, the war hadn't started, but obviously there were rumblings of it. So Austin worked here, and he also then moved to Beirut, again with the USIS, to work in Lebanon, very different setting. And I've often wondered, actually more recently wondered, whether these two jobs actually influenced him, because in both countries there was civil war and political strife brewing, right? So maybe that also was at the back of his mind in his later work. So that's something I just want to put out there. But this posting in Lebanon is interesting because he works with an ambassador who says, well, young man, you need to go and get some more study. And so he's urged to go and get a PhD. And he, at the same time, though, makes his first Indian friends. There is this military attaché to the embassy in Egypt, which is accredited to Lebanon, who he meets. And so it's really in Lebanon that he makes his first Indian friends. And perhaps them, but also his wife, who he marries around the same time, sort of instigate him to go on to study history, but South Asian history. And Austin sort of, decides, okay, my wandering around the world is enough. Let me go back to school. And he enrolls in 1959 for a PhD in South Asian Studies at St. Anthony's College in Oxford. Now, at Oxford, Austin has two mentors. The first is this guy called Colin Cuthbert Davies. He's written a variety of books that are sort of somewhat academic at this point, but he was obviously one of Austin's influences. He was very interested in the idea of the Commonwealth. In fact, interestingly, he was first a reader of Indian history, but before that, he was at the LSE. The second person who I understand to be Austin's PhD guide, I don't have a photo. I wrote to Oxford's archives, I wrote to Exeter's archives, I tried to look on genealogy. If you have one, please send it to me. All I have is a photo of a book with his name. But he was very influential because this guy, Francis Carnell, the other intellectual influence on Austin, was a lecturer at the Commonwealth Institute in Oxford. And he was particularly interested in East Asia, having worked on the Malayan Constitution. But his students studied emerging constitutions from around the world in the newly decolonized countries, right? This is the 60s. Countries across Africa and Asia are rapidly decolonizing, right? There are flags of independence being unfurled. Africa has suddenly 28 new countries, right, in the first few years of the 1960s. So this creates a lot of interest, excitement in Oxford, the colonial sort of knowledge center of the world. And so Carnell is dispatching his students to study the making of new constitutions in all these newly independent countries, right? And so Austin signs up to go to India. Now, who pushed him there, I don't really know. But he signs up to study Indian constitutional design under Carnell in Oxford. But obviously, this study can't be done only in Oxford. He has to go to India, and so he does. He arrives in 1960, August 1960. The heat is as it is today, searing with no air conditioning. And so he lands one very tired, sweaty night in Delhi. This is the verbatim account of his arrival in Delhi and making his way through the taxis to a hotel, which was, in some place that he couldn't really describe. But it's fascinating. This shows you how beautiful of a writer he was, because he could vividly describe, as if you can experience it today, what it was like. But we have to move on to what Austin really came to do, which is that he came to study the making of our Constitution, for which, as we know, we had debates. I guess that slide got missed. We had the debates, right? We had the published volumes. But what was missing were the files, the actual documents about why a provision was drafted in a certain way, the minutes of all the committees. And so for this, Austin really didn't get, this is a blank screen, it was not deliberate, but it does show you the fact that he really drew a blank, in a sense that the Babudam, I've called my obituary to Austin on scroll, which you can read. For those of you looking at your phones, do Google my name and Austin, and you might actually find that article interesting. That article says that in the early days of Austin's arrival in Delhi, he made no headway because nobody was offering to give him access to the files on the making of the Constitution. So somebody suggested to him, well, if they're not showing you the files and you're drawing a blank, then maybe you should go speak to the people who were involved in the exercise. So that's what he does. He makes a list of all the people he needs to see, and he starts calling them one by one. Now, he had this beautiful accent, which was a bit fake because he was an American, but with a name like Granville Austin, and you say, you just have to just have a slight intonation when people take you seriously, as you know, in this country. And that's what got him a lot of these interviews. Now, of course, other people introduced him, but he was really trying to understand what went on in the assembly, in the minds of the assembly members, but also among the leaders, right? And so for this, like I said, he had the debates, but you have to go behind the debates to the volumes that of Shivarao, which Sudarshan talked about, where the debates are put in the context of all the background deliberations that are taking place, the meetings, the committee meetings, the discussions between Patel, between Nehru, between Ambedkar, right, on the compromises, the wording of clauses in the Constitution. So one of the people he meets is K. Munshi. Some of you, sort of a not so well-known figure, although he deserves greater importance. One of the key non-Congress members of the Assembly. He had walked away from the Congress party. You can Google why. And he was someone who met Austin early and helped Austin a lot. So here you see a letter from K. Munshi saying, I have given you permission to look at all the papers in my files and microfilm them, and a certificate just in case anyone asks you later, okay? Now, what is very interesting is that Austin went to see other people as well, but he also decided to write the Prime Minister. This is like today tweeting Modi, my Indigo bus has not come, and I'm stuck, right? This toilet is not working, people tweet the railway minister, right? Something like that, right? It's a long shot. Let me write to the Prime Minister to see if he can help this young graduate student. But look at the beauty of this letter. I'm an American doing research in India, right? I dislike having to disturb you, the Prime Minister of India, as busy as you are, but I have waited to the last minute. I cannot access certain documents, right? This is a letter that Nehru receives and then apparently says, help this man. So the National Archives gets the message, and some documents are available to Austin. But the big break really comes when Austin goes for this very remarkable meeting. Again, invites himself to tea or gets invited with the president, Rajendra Prasad, right? Here's the actual copy of the letter, right? So according to Austin, they both sit cross-legged on the floor in Rashtrapati Bhavan, informally, and Austin, the redhead Austin, convinces Babu Rajendra Prasad to set him see the papers, but also borrow them. I used to always think this was a story that Austin invented, because in his letters he claimed that he impressed Prasad so much that Prasad let him take all these papers. There was no photocopying shop, there was no Xeroxing, but they had to be microfilmed, which is a technology where basically you copy, you take a photo like you do today, but in a different technology of the actual document, right? But yet, the idea that you could walk out of Rashtrapati Bhavan with the president's files seems rather, let's say, daring, to put it mildly. So I thought this was largely made up until I found last night the note from the president's secretary acknowledging Austin knew somebody would ask this question, and he had the guy on Government of India letterhead. I'm not going to show that letter, basically saying, it is true, Rajendra Prasad allowed you to borrow it, it is true you copied it, and it's true you returned it. Right? So I say this is the greatest sort of act of researchmanship. Even today, I challenge people to do that. But we must move on, which is Austin decided to bring his family, right? Until now, he was coming on these solo trips, but he now had 4 kids. And so it's difficult to basically sort of live transcontinentally. So he brings his family, moves them to Delhi. Lots of things happen. They go to Pushkar, Pahalgam, they celebrate Holi, but they are also in Delhi in May 1964. That fateful day, the 27th of May 1964, when the news comes that Nehru has passed away. So Austin makes his way with the thousands to Teen Murti, and the next day, the parents hold the children on their shoulders to watch the funeral procession go by. And that sentiment is captured in this beautiful letter, which has gone viral on Twitter. You can just look for it on Twitter. All of those who are following me on Twitter, I can see that. No, I'm joking. But if you are, do look at this letter. It is a letter that is not a. This is not a letter praising or worshiping Nehru. This is a letter really describing the sentiment in Delhi, in India, in a very dispassionate way. It's almost poetic the way he describes what he had seen and observed in those 2 days in Delhi, but the larger significance of the passing of Nehru, right? But it is also true that with the passing of Nehru, there was a question in Austin's mind, as there was in the mind of many Indians and commentators on India, about whether the republic would endure after Nehru, right? And so for Austin, this was an existentialist moment. Can he do the PhD, the study of the making of a constitution, of a republic whose prime minister had lived for 17 years and now is suddenly gone, and what would happen after him? In fact, there was a book by another American his age called After Nehru Who? And this is basically what happened, which is Shastri was elected by the Congress power brokers of the time. So there was constitutional continuity, we know that. And this, of course, reassured Austin, but also the 1965 war. Why? Because during the 65 war, Austin was surprised, unlike other countries where the military took over, martial law was proclaimed when there was a hostility. In India, the civilians took the military decisions, right? Or at least they were responsible for the leadership of the war, and there were no troops running the government, right? So these two developments convinced him that the founders of the republic had chosen wisely, and democracy through the Constitution would endure. The Constitution had survived its first stress test. Now, we must move on, which is that Austin then goes back to Oxford. He completes his PhD thesis. He chooses the unusual name, Tryst with Destiny. Obviously, that's a somewhat of an overused name. So he is advised to change it to Cornerstone. So what is Cornerstone, or the Gospel of Cornerstone, as Upendra Bakshi somewhat, let's say, half sarcastically but half in good humor describes it, right? There are many parts of it, right? Here's the official version of Cornerstone, which you don't see often because this is the first edition. The Indian edition only comes out in 72. This is the 66 sort of OUP English edition. But Cornerstone is many things, right? But at the end of the day, Cornerstone is a great drama, right? It is a series of events of following people, what was happening in the assembly, but according to themes, right? Sudarshan mentioned the fundamental rights. So Austin describes the background and the circumstances in which the Constituent Assembly was debating the Constitution, making the Constitution, drafting the fundamental rights. He has this beautiful phrase, the fundamental rights were framed in the midst of fundamental wrongs. What does he mean? What did he mean by that? It is that there was great carnage. There was violence of unspeakable proportions. There was burning and looting in the streets. Members in the assembly could smell the fires outside. They needed curfew passes to come in while they were debating the fundamental rights. So obviously that impacted the way they reacted to these developments. And Austin sort of makes these connections between how the Constitution came into being, but the conditions prevailing in Delhi and in the country at large, right? So this, in fact, there's actually a recent essay which I found while preparing for this talk called the Prejudice and Passion in the Assembly According to Cornerstone. And this guy, Vatsal Naresh, says that there was so much passion in the assembly that some people had sort of lost their sense of judgment. Now, I don't know if that's true, but it's very interesting to see that Cornerstone, in a way, gives you that sense of not just what was happening in the assembly, but outside, and that obviously impacting the inside. Now, we move on, which is that Cornerstone, there's many other things we don't have time to describe. I can spend 3 days sort of, unpacking Cornerstone, but it does create and etch many memories, many myths about India's creation story. We don't have time to discuss them, but there are lots of new, younger scholars who are looking at Austin respectfully, critically, with skepticism, with let's say, awe. And I think it's good to follow all of that. But I want to focus instead on Cornerstone's most controversial sentence. There's one sentence which Prime Minister Modi also quoted in Parliament that Austin has in Cornerstone, which is that the Indian Constitution is first and foremost a social document. Now, Austin prepares us for this claim in his lucid introduction to Cornerstone, which should be read. He says three things. The Constitution was to foster the achievement of many goals, transcendental among them was that of the social revolution. He then says this revolution would bring about fundamental changes in the structure of Indian society, and that the theme of the social revolution runs throughout the proceedings. So this is a fascinating thing, right? This is, he says in his introduction. So if you want to talk about who is a transformativist, who is a person who's arguing that the Constitution is a radical document, here is the evidence, right? In the opening sentences of Cornerstone. But he moves on. So look at, for instance, he says, look at, this is the sort of the contents of our Constitution, right? The first page of the sort of the outline of the theme of the chapter. Then he says this entire scheme is infected by the idea of a social revolution. How? For that, he basically says that the Constitution really has three animating principles. First, the idea of the social revolution, and he says there's direct influence in four areas: in parliamentary government and direct elections, in the fundamental rights, in the directive principles of state policy, obviously, the social revolution, and in the wording and the design of the legislative, executive, and judicial provisions. All of the powers under our Constitution, of how the provisions of the Constitution under which power is divided, both between the center and the states, but also between the executive and the judiciary. He then says there is another competing or parallel or sort of, naturally occurring cross-current in the Constitution, which is national unity and stability. And here he says this theme influenced the federation language provisions. It influenced a lot of the legislative provisions, the powers of the parliament, the competences, and then the shape of the federal structure. And then he says there were other themes, lots of other noise, other sort of, let's say, sort of a miscellany of different things, which include, he puts in minority interests, although that could fall under the other themes too, efficient government and administration, and most importantly, national security. Just note national security, how low it is here, right? Although it is sort of central, obviously, to the national unity and stability theme. So this is just to show you in a schematic how he envisioned the theme of social revolution and how impactful it was in the making of our Constitution, right? So this is now I showed you the outline to the Constitution. Now this is the outline of a book. Now look at that. Look at this is the first page, right? Which road to the social revolution? That's his second chapter. The first chapter is about how the Constituent Assembly met, who were they, what were the elections, how are they indirectly elected, all of that stuff is answered there. He goes into this whole issue of the big question confronting the framers was which road to take. I mean, just think of the imagery, right? Whether we take a road to socialism, like the Soviet Union, or we take a road to, let's say, a liberal free market democracy. And he says this was a big conundrum facing the members. So he looks at the alternatives, and then what road was actually taken, the reasons for the choice, right? We can go on and on, right? But he talks here then about the conscience of the Constitution, which are the directive principles. In the fundamental rights, he talks about social reform. So again, this, I submit, is one aspect of Austin which we need to rediscover, the idea that he was, if not a prophet, a sort of a town crier for the idea that the Constitution is a radical, revolutionary social document. Now, we must move on, but there are two things that Austin also adds we must remember, which nobody else did at that time, for which he is a forerunner. He talked about how the Indian people were walking in darkness, and they saw this great light. It's sort of a biblical reference to the fact that there was a gong, as he put it, that reverberated around India when the Constituent Assembly decided to give universal suffrage. Against advice and practice, no other country in the world had given people who couldn't read and who didn't have property the right to vote, but that was a decision taken by the Assembly, right? And a decision that worked out to be a bet, but a bet that was a winning bet because it created legitimacy in the Constitution among those who did not participate in the electing of those who drafted the Constitution, but could participate in the processes that the Constitution created. And this too is another thing that Austin shines a light on for the first time. You now have a lot of other scholars, Onit Shani, this Israeli scholar, but it's really Austin who really says, look, one of the big achievements as part of the social revolution was the right that every Indian would get the right to vote, which frankly was a big experiment, and an experiment that lots of people said would be doomed to fail. Now we must move on. There were a lot of critiques of Austin. I invite you to read the one by Professor Bakshi, and we don't have time to get into it, but it is half as long as the book, which means it was quite long, but it is also a very enriching Indian sort of response to Austin. But what does Austin then do, right? What does the book do? It frames the narrative, the national narrative, the narrative of the creation of the republic, the creation story of how India became a nation, right? And that happens through the Supreme Court, because we were discussing today, how did the Supreme Court get access to Austin? Austin is 27 or 28 when he writes his PhD thesis. We'll then see he disappears, but he does one thing very smartly. Within sort of 2 years of him submitting his thesis, he gets it published. Published, not much money paid, but a handsome book is produced. And the Supreme Court, in the year of publication, somebody probably walked to Bari Books or whatever the bookshop in Delhi was then and bought a copy and gave it to a lawyer arguing. And the Chief Justice of India then, K. Subbarao, cites Austin as a learned author. Just imagine, as a 28 or 29-year-old, you get cited in your first book by the Chief Justice in the most important case of the time, Golaknath, where the court holds by a narrow majority that Parliament has no right, doesn't have the power to amend the fundamental rights. Obviously, this was a very controversial decision. The minute it came down, there were attempts to undo it. And so you had the 24th Amendment, the 25th Amendment, all of which you may have learned in constitutional law, to basically undo this holding that Parliament has no power to amend the Constitution. And remember, guess what all this was about? The social revolution, right? All of this was to undo what the Parliament was thinking, or the executive was thinking, as roadblocks that the judiciary was facing in the road to the social revolution, which Austin had described, right? So in the Keshavananda Bharati case, Austin is so influential that out of the 12 judges who write judgments, okay, or the 12 judgments that get into 11 judgments, except one judge, everybody refers to Austin. That is, barely 7 years after the book's out. And this continues. You have, as I think Sudarshan mentioned, the Supreme Court referring to Austin in lots of cases. In Indira Gandhi's election case. Why important case? Because it ratified the basic structure doctrine. In the Rajasthan election case. In the Minerva Mills case, which Justice Nariman is very fond of saying is one of the most important cases because it affirmed and applied the basic structure doctrine, but is one of a narrowly divided case. Narrowly divided because 3-2 they divided. And guess what? Both majority and minority cite Austin, right, in their support, which is quite funny. Isn't it flattering to be both sided by both the minority? And in fact, the minority sort of central holding of the minority depends on what Austin says, which is the Constitution is a social document, right? So now you see the courts really borrowing and have taken this rhetoric quite seriously. But it's not just the court, right? Now, as recently, not in the 80s, not the court only of the 80s, as recently as 2020, our present Chief Justice Chandrachud, in his decision in Gujarat Mazdoor Sangh about paying laborers wages during the pandemic, look at his extensive cites to Austin. This I can't show you the footnotes. He's got 4 footnotes. And he puts this, see, it's very clear how even Chief Justice Chandrachud sort of looks at Austin and Austin's proclamation or his heralding that the Constitution is about a social revolution. Now, we can go on, but let's move to Parliament. There too, Austin is cited across the aisle. Part of my research, I found people from the BJP, obviously, to the communists. This is KP Unnikrishnan, sort of Congress, apart from Congress, the DMK, all citing Austin, right? So remember, the true is not, SCY may or may not be cited in Parliament, but for a book to be cited both in the legislature and judiciary, it has to be obviously persuasive, right? Now, Austin is all over the place, right? You don't even need me to give you a summary. You can go watch Mr. DPK, whoever he is, who basically does a YouTube version, who offers to help you summarize Austin. There are many of these. These are all these courses that now people prepare for judicial service exam, for CLAT, for UPSC, right? Austin has now become, why is he's not necessarily giving you this just for fun, because you're going to be asked questions in the exam. And so those questions in the exam are, what happened, who did what, and that's because of Austin, right? So this again is framing the narrative in a way that no legal scholar can even dream of, right? So then what else happens? Austin is the only author, legal author, who has been translated into 12 Indian languages. In fact, this is Hindi or Sanskrit? Hindi? Okay, I'm joking, because there is a Sanskrit version also. And Kannada or Telugu, I always get confused. I think this is Telugu. But there's, if you want to read Austin in Marathi, in Punjabi, there's for you. Latest issue in Kashmiri. This is just come out in May. Austin in Kashmiri, Austin in Urdu has just come out. Austin in Tamil and Malayalam under development. The National Translation Mission has chosen very few books, like Newton's Principia, for translation in all 22 languages. Austin is one of those books. That too is again shaping a narrative in a very unconscious way. But we have to move on, which is come back to this issue of why I consider, therefore, he's a prophet or a forebearer of transformative constitution, which is the rage. And here, I'm not getting into a big debate about transformative constitution, because that will take us even longer than I'm speaking for. But very quickly, let's summarize. It mostly comes from South Africa, even though there are other antecedents. In a nutshell, the idea of transformative constitution is that a constitution like India or like South Africa, from where this came, is a constitution, at least the 96 constitution, that came after a very dark period, a period of great darkness and despair. And so the new South Africa wanted to create this rainbow society where everyone would be equal, right? And so it was, in a sense, a constitutional revolution that needed a radical document that would transform a society that was so unequal. That's really how this idea that a constitution can be transformative came. But my point is that we didn't have to wait for the South African Constitution of 1996. This already happened in India, and Austin was one of those who had already made this message. We didn't have to wait for the South Africans to tell us and then borrow it and say, oh, we're all transformativists now. We were. That's my point in this lecture. So there I must also give credit to Professor Upendra Bakshi. Before it became a rage, because Justice Chandrachud cited it, and lots of other scholars, Upendra Bakshi had the wisdom in 2010 to organize a seminar in Delhi where he looked at Brazil, India, and South Africa, and he first signals the promise and the power of this idea that the Constitution is a transformative document, and that he signals in an essay he writes in this volume. In true Bakshi style, it's let's say a piece you must read and reread, but it is a piece that we must also remember is the first piece that tries to articulate what transformative constitutionalism means in India, right? But we move on to Chief Justice Chandrachud, who, as you know, is one of the big fans of transformative constitutionalism, which is why it is in several judgments that the Chief Justice, then as a sitting or associate justice, authored Navtej Johar on 377, and then, of course, in the Sabrimala case, right? And we don't need to get into the merits of those cases, but you know that transformative constitutional reasoning plays an important role in all these cases. Now, we move on, which is to simply say that I wish, there are lots of problems with transformative constitutionalism. There is Siddharth Narayan's article. I've also written in India Forum some of the problems I have with this idea of transformative constitutionalism. I believe there are limitations to where you can adopt and use this technique. So, but I still think that this genie can't be put back into the bottle. You may have watched Sai Deepak's very fiery video, which I urge you to watch, both in Hindi and English. He's given a lecture recently where he talks about the limitations of transformative constitution. And he warns, and Sai Deepak is someone we must take seriously and engage with on these issues, because he is a formidable debater. And he argues, I'm not saying whether I sort of approve or not, but he argues quite passionately, transformative constitutionalism is a power grab by the judiciary. That's his view, right? Or sort of my understanding of his view. And In the light of all that, though, the question is, what happens to the doctrine? We will have to now see. Maybe Chief Justice Chandrachud, in the same-sex marriage case, may say something more. It's interesting, in the last year, the Chief Justice hasn't used its doctrine much, but it may come up again. But this genie cannot be put back into the bottle. Why? This idea of transformativeness is now infecting lots of other fields of law. It's transformative environmental law, transformative gender justice law, right? So that's why, please watch this space. But we need to move on and back to Austin, what happened when all this buzz, right? All this is from Cornerstone. I'm saying Cornerstone was the first transformative book. He then went missing. This is 1967. He unleashes all this. The court starts quoting him. But if in the 1970s you wanted to go interview Mr. Austin, you couldn't find him. Why? Because Austin, Bakshi says he's Rip Van Winkle. He says, what happened all these years? Now we know. We know because I have access to the papers. Maybe Sudarshan knew, but not many people in India knew, which is Austin joined the State Department. See the word intelligence. Those who can wake up everyone. He worked for the Bureau of Intelligence. Now, this is not the CIA, okay? But it is a part of the State Department which produces national intelligence estimates for the US government. So here is an interesting memo to President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, drafted by Granville Austin. This is the year after Cornerstone. Nothing to do with Cornerstone. This is about arms race, right? So he's moved on. He's gone to his next job. He's done his PhD, moved on to the Middle East, moved on to US foreign policy, as if, next thing. But it was not like India was out of his mind. The Delhi Gymkhana Club says, you're still in the waiting list. Do we want to keep you? You might get a membership in 10 years. He said yes. Then he also writes this letter and he says, well, can I get a job in Delhi? But look at this unusual response he gets from his college, which is that because of America's bad name in the world, maybe you shouldn't work in India. It was the height of the Vietnam War, right? So Austin did try to come back. Obviously, he couldn't tweet about it, but it was not like he disappeared. He then holds a series of other jobs. Elliot Richardson was one of those people who was a great cabinet secretary under Nixon, but Austin was not really allied with Nixon, but was fond of Elliot Richardson, so he works there, kind of working for a minister in this country. He then comes back to the State Department, working in a very influential department, policy planning, and then sort of leaves there and then does a variety of things between the 70s and 80s. He writes an article on higher education. Middle East is his big passion, Middle East peace. He writes articles in the New York Times. He gets hate mail for it. People write to him and say, how can you say these things, right? This is when he's sort of rediscovered by the man in this room. In other presentations, I show a photo of Sudarshan, but since he's sitting here in Fresh and Bread, and for those of you watching, if you just rewind the tape, you will see him actually have spoken. I don't need to show you his photo, but as he beautifully says in an email to me, which I hope he will write in an article, he went on this frantic search to find Austin because there was a guru. I thought it was a saffron guru, but he told me today it was T.G. Vaidyanathan, who was a film critic, but a film critic, a famous professor of English in Bangalore, who basically said that when someone completes half a circle, you need to complete the full circle. So that's why I call it turning the full circle. And Sudarshan, again, not putting words in your mouth, but as you've told me, wanted Austin to finish the full circle. So he had set about finishing half the circle with Cornerstone by describing the making of our Constitution. He wanted him to come back and do the other half, which is what? Describing how it had worked. So he knocks on the door, gets a call, they sign he manages to get Austin back to India. He comes back to India, a country he hasn't been to in 20 years. Then he writes this report to Sudarshan. I don't know if you've seen this. I found this, you probably saw this a long time ago. I wanted one thing to surprise you, but maybe you saw it recently. This is basically a report Austin writes to Sudarshan saying, okay, I'm going to do the second book, right? But I don't know what your original plan was. This is 1987, 89, 90, 91, 92. He goes to the India International Center. He loves the bar. He talks to anyone. He will not have a drink alone. If there's a free table, he will invite himself and sit next to you and ask you who you are. Very convivial man who was really a sort of a magnet of information, right? But he went back home and wrote down everything, right? Look at this. This is diary 17. There were over 50, right? Detail what somebody told him at this party, that party, but also very significant things. And of course, see, he would keep all the people he met, very meticulous. Look at the page numbers. But at some point, all of this was too much, right? He kept writing. Those are notes on Minerva Mills. This is a letter from Mr. Palkiwala, Krishna Iyer, from his friend S. Guhan. Huge pile of information. You're flooded. What do you do? So he's almost about to give up, and then Nancy says, you made that promise to Sudarshan. We have to keep it. So 12 years after, or 13 years after you went knocking on the door in Washington without even a phone call, because there was no email or phone to call Austin, he took a gamble, knocked on the door, said, come back to India, and he came. But it took 12 years for Austin, unlike this building constructed in repeated time. Austin produces the book, Working, which now completes the full circle. This book, which describes the constitutions working, and is sort of the second volume to Cornerstone. Now, again, we don't have time to get into the book because this book itself can take several days to go over, but obviously it gets more adulation for Austin. I think that Sudarshan takes him to Kerala, and Austin writes in his diary that the Kerala judges treated him as if he framed the constitution himself, because he gets such reverence and adulation, right? And so here you see from Raj's great mentor, the President Narayan. I thought you would like this picture, Raj, because you have a similar picture with the president. And here he says, I mean, which president writes to an author saying, you know, I have referred to your book. And remember, Narayan had to deal with lots of constitutional crises, right? So this is very telling, right? Now, Bakshi is back. Professor Bakshi is back. And it is a beautiful, I mean, it's frustrating. I understood 30% when I read this 20 years ago. I reread it last night, and I understood about maybe 65. I probably will get it, but it's beauty. There is an air of mystery to the second coming of Austin. And he says, Saint Granville Austin, Professor Bakshi might listen to this, so I'm scared of saying something that might displease him, but he is not necessarily flattering Austin by calling him saint. He's saying all of us have made Austin into a saint because we keep using him. So we quote him so reverently that as if he says a gospel, right? This is a beautiful review of the second book, stunning review. Okay, I think it's one of the most penetrating reviews that I urge all of you to download and read it. Again, we don't have time to go into it, but there is one part of the review that is particularly biting. Austin says, Bakshi says, Austin tells us he kind of normalizes constitutional crisis. And he says that ugly as the emergency was in Delhi in 1976, it was not Berlin under Hitler. He's particularly irked by the sentence, which he feels sort of downplays emergency, right? And so this criticism, though, bothers Austin, because Austin's book is also a great documentation of emergency. We would not have known all of those decisions that were taken in the 39th Amendment, the 42nd Amendment, right? Until Austin documents them in this book. But obviously this was not enough, or maybe Bakshi felt that the narrative was a little too trying to please everyone. So Austin decides that let me write a third book that would focus only on the emergency. And so he had a lot of files. Here's, you know, he had already built a huge file. In fact, Professor Christoph Jaffrello has written an entire book only looking at Austin's files on the emergency. Just recently come out book. So Austin decides, though, I need to see the law ministry's files. So he writes to everyone he knew, because obviously he knew he had met Prime Minister Gujral. So he writes this very charming letter, thinking like Nehru it might work, right? That earlier letter. But he then gets the total Sarkari response. Dear Shri Granville Austin, this has reference to your letter to the Home Secretary regarding an undertaking of Mrs. Gandhi's emergency to write an objective book. The matter has been looked to at the moment the concerned files are classified and not possible to make available to you. So unfortunately, there's not much he can do, and so Austin gives up, not entirely. He still writes here and there, but gradually fades away. Now, I do want to sort of conclude with three reflections, right? Which is about why Austin still makes sense. And again, Austin, I'm not trying to do a full reappraisal of Austin, really focusing him on this idea that he was this herald of chronicler, this beacon for the idea of transformative constitutionalism, right? And this is important because I feel that Austin was the first to instigate awareness and a quest of understanding in our founders. I do not like the word founding fathers, as Chief Justice Chandrachud told Mr. Singhvi the other day. We're one of the countries which had founding women and men, but let's be also gender neutral. We had founding persons, founding founders of our country, right? These were people who drafted and formulated the Constitution, erected the Republic, and Austin legitimizes the studying of their backgrounds. Until then, people only looked at what they said in the assembly. Nobody knew where they were from, what their social background was, what their caste background was. Did they participate in the freedom movement? Were they arrested and jailed? All of that is Austin. If you look at Austin's back of Austin's book, he has a detailed bibliography of everybody, where they were born, what caste they were, what was their participation in the freedom movement, what was their legal career before they joined the movement, right? All of this means you're trying to investigate a document written by people who come to the assembly with their experiences and their backgrounds, which themselves are transformative. How do you get a transformative document written by people who are bureaucrats, right? So he basically says the people in the assembly were themselves somewhat radical and revolutionary, and therefore we have a transformative document. The second thing he does, though, is to create a sense of drama about the founding of the republic, right? And therefore, Shyam Benekal relies extensively on Cornerstone for the television mini-series, which I hope most of you at least have seen one chapter. It was used to be in very high Hindi for me, and actually sort of Hindustani, but now there is a sort of a subtitle version which makes it more accessible to all. The debate on untouchability in the Samvidhan series, for instance, is vividly portrayed for those who aren't interested or able to access the dry debates or the Shiva Rao books that Sudarshan talked about. And you can really see the Constitution's transformative potential in the wake of harsh social realities come alive through the series, right? And Austin, in a sense, is, the director gets his script from Austin, right? Now, I want to point out, though, that there are notable differences between Austin's method of the Constitution being a radical social document and the contemporary understandings of transformative constitutionalism, according to Bhatia, according to Chandrachud. One is the difference is that Austin, at least in the early writing, thought that the legislature should take the lead. He felt there were certain areas where the judiciary couldn't go into. But in the second book, after seeing what had happened in emergency, he sort of takes a U-turn. But at the end of the day, it's important to remember that, like the Constitution being a social document, this idea of transformative constitutionalism is a method of interpretation. It can be used or misused to reach a conclusion that's right or wrong. And let's take, without getting into the merits of the case, the recent Supreme Court decision, Aishat Shifa versus the state of Karnataka. Now, as you know, this decision, the judges have split, so the matter has gone to the Chief Justice, right? Now, in Aishat Shifa, Justice Gupta notes that the social revolution ushered by the Constitution to reconstruct India's social structure on the modern foundations of secular education. And this he took to mean that religious beliefs cannot be carried to a secular school maintained out of state funds, and therefore the state could outlaw the wearing of hijab in these schools. Now, again, without entering to the rival merits of this case or the contentions made, it just shows you that reasoning that sounds transformative can be used to employ a conclusion that transformativists may not agree with, right? So that's sort of the limited purpose of making this point. And I finally want to end this lecture, which I know has gone on a little longer than I expected, by narrating a conversation I had with a young law student. I met her 2 days ago, and I asked her why she chose law school. Her answer was clear and convincing, but since I thought you may not believe me, I thought let me have her explain it in her own words.
Hi, my name is Vidita Govindachari and I am a first year law student at the Gujarat National Law University. 4 years ago, before I knew what I really wanted to do, I came across this book entirely by chance. But even then, something compelled me to pick it up and read it. This turned out to be a decision that changed the way I look at the world. Mr. Austin's book left me with an unshakable faith in the ideals of the Indian Constitution, and it made me realize that the law is so much more than just words on a piece of paper. It is a living, breathing creation that belongs to each of us. If I'm being very honest, I can safely say that Mr. Granville Austin's book is the reason why I decided to become a lawyer.
I think that's a fitting end to this lecture. Thank you, one and all.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Akriti Tripathi, Assistant Professor and Deputy Director of the 3-year and 5-year law programs at JGLS. I may just take the liberty to say that this lecture has not been only a historical as well as a futuristic insight into the contributions of Dr. Granville Austin, but actually an example of shared history, especially with Professor Sudarshan's, I would say, close association. So I think it's been quite a privilege and an honor. I would like to begin by thanking our esteemed speaker for the day, Mr. Raghavan. Thank you so much for taking out time, and thank you for reminding us of the radical potential that our Constitution possesses and our sense of being as citizens of this country, of being Indian. We truly trace it back to the Indian Constitution, as chaotic and as colorful the history is. Apart from that, obviously, Professor Dr. C. Rajkumar, founding Vice Chancellor of JGLS, Professor Srijit, Professor Sudarshan. I am obviously presenting this on behalf of Professor Sridhar Patnaik, so it will be injustice if I do not acknowledge his absence today. Apart from that, assistant deans, the team, for as well as faculty members, dear students, for being so patient, bearing the cold in the room for a very, very interesting lecture. Our staff members, our IT team, and everybody else who've been so keenly involved in making this lecture come to fruition and so successfully. So we're very indebted to you. Thank you so much for a meaningful lecture. Thank you so much.